Thanks. It set me up. Um, but there's a lot of folks in here that I know, some I don't know. I've been kind of like Tanya said. First off, thanks for having me, and Peter, thanks for tolerating my somewhat like I guess ghosting of text messages and like it's just so. But it's not just you. Like it's hard to like text people and get so it's just hopefully you tolerate it okay. But no, no like I, this space is an interesting one. I was just telling Jonah. I had told myself I had these notes and everything else, and then you come into rooms and the energy shifts, right? And what I was going to say now kind of doesn't fit. I'm like, dang it, now here I am, like black dude, bunch of white folks again, trying to figure out what it is I could say in this space because power exists in spaces, so you have to really try and like live within it. And so thanks, Jonah, for being there for me because again, you got to find people who can kind of like help ground you. So if you don't know Jonah, that's my man over there. So anyway, I'm originally from East Cleveland, Ohio. East Cleveland is its own city. It's not a neighborhood in Cleveland. It is its own municipality is 3.5 square miles. It's literally the most cash poor city in the state of Ohio. People are making about $17,000 a year. That's where I was born. So now, during COVID is where I moved back. I live right next door to my parents, where we've got chickens, bees, farms now. We kind of like are reimagining like from the ground up what it looks like for urban farming to not just be a program, but to actually have urban farmers be farmers, like I experienced while I was living in Vermont. Like, farming is a way of life. It's not a program, and when you fund it as grants, it doesn't become a part of the existence of the community, and people can't really tap into, the way of life that I experienced while I was living in Vermont. But so I'm there, kind of reimagining what to do if we were to build anchors from the ground up. Because when you have a city like East Cleveland, where Cleveland Clinic divested from, GE divested from, Case Western Reserve divested from, you've got this wake of like extraction. You know exactly what happens when you take, and you divest and you leave. You have a city that's 95% black that has been deemed as not investable. And so now you've got to recreate anchors. And so all the while I'm traveling back and forth during COVID and trying to figure out like what to do. I was also doing something in Roxbury, which was it hatched out of the work that I had been doing with a dear friend of mine. I don't know if Thea and Megan are here from Boston Medical Center, but we had been doing some other work while I was at CommonWealth Kitchen of trying to get some supplier diversity through the food service, and we were trying to get some of the people who had been in his work, trying to get forward contracts with some of the farms we're working with, so some of the entrepreneurs, all to be stymied and given promise, and all the stuff we know. It's just such a difficult thing when you're dealing with unprincipled policies, both big P and little p, within the institutions that we serve. But I built relationships with people within those anchor institutions. And so the relationships with people are kind of like what continue to like encourage me and other folks to continue to like dive in. But I'll get into that a little later about like, so there is going to be some kind of critique around anchor institutions because I am, I'm a social critic. I'm a child of Black Panthers, so I've kind of like have that in me. My daddy was a nationalist, Pan-African upbringing, which kind of signaled why Nubian markets and Nubian Square is actually what it is. It's a celebration of the African diaspora, prioritizing black and brown farmers and producers within the aligned ecosystem. And I'm moving away from that whole kind of local thing, and I can explain why a little bit, because local is important. Alignment is way more important to me at this point. And so, being from East Cleveland, I mean, I was homeschooled too, right? So I was homeschooled, so taught early that, man, do we really need systems to like govern you? Like my parents were like, man, really challenging everything. So I went to went to junior college, and I transferred over to Case Western for a little bit, and I was doing some tributary habitat research on the Great Lakes watershed. And while I was in university, I was also at culinary school, so I was doing that. And as Tanya mentioned, I also then opened the cafe, Crust and Crumbs, which I opened because I got frustrated because I had bought at the time, it was a $13 hamburger from a chef. And I was excited because everybody was talking about this burger, and I was like, all right, cool, 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 I want to try it. And it was a good burger, but the ketchup was not handmade, right? It wasn't made in-house, right? You know, the bun was, the mustard wasn't made in-house, right? The aioli was, I think. And so I was like, well, dang, how are you charging this much? And you still have Heinz ketchup on the table, right? So I really wanted to just say, I want to make the best burger with everything that was handmade, like the bun, the ketchup, the mustard, the mayonnaise, everything. And then I think it kind of justified a $13 burger at the time. Now it would probably be like a $20 burger, but back then it was 13 bucks. And so I said, well, okay, well, look, can I make the best burger in Cleveland? And so that's when I jumped out of academia, because I thought I was going to go into like environmental science work. Back then it was, it was like the kooky, nobody knew, like it was just like, oh really? So I was kind of getting made fun of a little bit, and I kind of like peer pressure. I was 22, and I went into culinary space, and then that's when I opened up the cafe. And then from that, we were small space. It was like 800 square feet, but we did absolutely everything from scratch. We cut absolutely no corners. And it worked. I mean, it worked because, it was a family business. It was like me, my partner, like my cousins. I wasn't paying my cousins, my sister. It worked. But it totally worked. But it was fun. Like, it was really fun. And then then they rezoned. They wanted to rezone the area. And so they asked us, did we want to move to this new area? So we got some money from the city, and we said, okay, we're going to move. And then right when that happened, we put like $30,000 into the move. I then went to New York City. I worked under Charlie Palmer for a little bit. And then when I came back, that's when like that recession of like that hit the Midwest really hard, and it hit Cleveland really hard, to where the foreclosure crisis happened. And that's when I moved to Vermont. So when I moved to Vermont, kind of like, was like, all right, I needed to reset. I moved to Putney first. I lived on a small little horse farm with Randy Zyder. And then I kind of met a whole bunch of farmers. And this was my first experience, like being in a rural space. And I kind of like got some hippie training, right? I was like, all right, well, cool. This is, I don't need shoes. I can like, kind of do some stuff. So I'm doing all this stuff. And I'm just learning like so much. And remember, mind you, like I had been like, again, like that. I don't even think it was homeschooled back then. I think it would be called unschooled now, because my parents we didn't do anything except for whatever I wanted to do. And that's kind of like why even still now I just kind of keep going. So it's like this unruly kind of child doing whatever I want to do. But I'm there, and my friend Mike Collins from Old Athens Farm, and actually Howie, we played around with this idea of having this place called the Compostery, right? Because all this stuff, they were schlepping all of this food to the farmer's market in Brattleboro. And then I was like, Michael, like, what are you doing? He was like, man, whatever, man. Just, it's going, and bring it back, and it would be in the corner. And so as a chef, I was like, man, we would just have little, like, kind of parties out of the compost heap. And that's when me and my partner Liz in Putney came up with this idea called the Gleanery. And we said, we obviously can't call it Compostery, it won't work. But so we said, we're going to call it the Gleanery. And so we said, all right, well, we did the Gleanery. And it's still open to this day. Like, I'm not there, I'm still a partner there. But the fact that it's still open is a tribute to that sort of thinking. Like we were in inquiry at that time to say, what are we doing? Like, the only reason this is too expensive is because you're growing too much, Michael. Like, stop growing as much, stop schlepping it to the farmer's market, and you could actually charge less. And he was like, well, okay, well, then what can we do? So we crafted this restaurant, and I didn't have enough money. And that's when I got introduced to Transition Putney. And so we did this whole thing. We run this through the Strolling of the Heifers. If you're from Vermont, you know some of this stuff. But Strolling of the Heifers, we won this business plan competition to where we went out into rooms like this, and we said, hey, look, if I gave you 9% on your investment, what would you say? They were like, oh, cool, let's do it. They were like, what are you made off? I'm like, no, we're going to pay you back in food. We're going to pay you back in food, and we're going to amortize it over 3 years. So people gave us the investment, $500, $1,000, and $1,500, and then we paid people back monthly at $15, $25, and $45, depending on the amount they were in, and we gave them 9%. You had to use it or lose it, and what we didn't know at the time that was going to happen, because I don't have an MBA, but I would have been able to predict a hockey curve of like profit to the organization after 3 years, because we were no longer paying people back after 3 years. And if we did a good job, people were connected to the restaurant, and they were bringing people in, they were celebrating what we were doing, and of course that money came back to the organization. So we were losing at the beginning, but because we did a good job, that's the only reason we're still open, because we had built such a strong following at the beginning with the community and also the farmers, because even the farmers, they kind of lent the produce because they had the relationships up front. We were able to say, dude, I've been a chef for like 5 years. You know I'm going to buy from you. Just give it to me. You're composting it anyway. I'll pay you like in 6 months. And they're like, all right. And so that was the beginning. We didn't have enough money, but we went out to the community and asked these very like real questions and challenge people to just kind of lean into the realities, because we're in these social constructs that are just like, I guess we got to schlep all this stuff, charge people what, we think it should be based upon like known shrink and wastage, and then not really keep anything, right? And then when it came time to come to investors, so I was like, oh, cool, we got this model, we want to scale it up. Investors look at me like, dude, like, you're not taking any money out of this thing. It's not profitable. I said, no, it can't be, because we actually are paying people what they deserve, and we're paying farmers what they deserve. And I'm not taking any money out of it. And so they're like, well, that's not a fundable business. I was like, but it still exists. And so funders would not touch this model, and it's still open to this day. And so during the pandemic, the landlord at the time, during the pandemic, was like, oh, we're good. You don't have to even worry about rent, because you're such a valuable asset in the community that we're good. And so this sort of community-based infrastructure is super important, because now you have relationships and you can begin to understand what's needed. And the fact that investors weren't willing to invest in something because we were choosing to pay, we choose to pay equitable wages to our employees, and pay farmers what they deserve, and we have, some strategies in place to not be extractive, like me saying, well, look, if I wanted to pull some money out of it, I could, but it wouldn't make any sense to me. And so that's still some work that needs to be done on the funder side to say, well, are we really trying to invest in transformative measures, or do we want to continue to just encourage people to be extractive? And I'm not willing to be, well, at that time I thought, I was like, I'm not willing to be extractive. And then fast forward to now, I went through this period of like, okay, at the time I was in Vermont, I was coming back and forth to Boston, and I met Doug from Daily Table, and we were trying to devise like, how can we look at secondary and tertiary markets to scale up this sort of more, this grocery store that engenders dignity by leveraging food waste. And we had this sort of like challenge of, who wants to eat, a whole bunch of slop, right? Basically, because that's what people think about waste, right? And then you have these other people talking like, you're eating freaking compost. They have this viral stuff of people eating compost out of dumpsters. They're like, you're not dumpster diving here, right? It's really not. And so we have to deal with that in the city of Boston. And I was able to go out into community. And at the first store we opened, it was in Dorchester. And the community was like, oh my God, you're gonna like feed us, rich people's garbage. And this is what I said. I said, well, look, currently it was one of these things where like Doug couldn't do this because like he didn't have a restaurant in Vermont that was actually feeding rich people's garbage. So I would say I was like, actually, I got rich people buying their own garbage up in Vermont, and it's cool. And so it was some very interesting dynamics that were happening there. Um, and it was a cool thing. And so we were able to do it. And to this day, I mean, so I helped kind of get that going with the commissary kitchen. And they actually opened up their fourth store in Mattapan just now. So it's just nice to be a part of that legacy. And like, they're doing good work. And then so from that, then I'm like, all right, well, what do I want to do next? I'm still like playing around with stuff. And Doug at the time like was like, dude, you're way too socialist for me. I'm like, dude, you're too capitalist for me. So we had this crazy relationship, which is awesome. We're good friends now, and it's still, but it was challenging. It wasn't easy because his way of doing it was very like, I mean, he was at the time he was executive director of Conscious Capitalism. I'm like, that's a freaking oxymoron, bro. Like, I don't understand. And so it was some of this stuff. So we have these debates. And one of the reasons why I said, okay, I think it's time for me to move on was because I said, it was just this one question around, why do we always wait to do stuff differently when we leave an organization, when we leave, right? And so this was the pivotal question that we were trying to figure out and around. Like, if we're in these influential spaces, can we be more impactful? Can we do relevant things while we're still relevant, I think is the question. And once you leave an organization, you leave behind so much hard work, and someone else is trying to pick up with the work that you're doing, and it's harder to kind of start back up. And so I said to myself, I think I need to like move on and figure out something else that's from the ground, like from the beginning. And that's when we started to play around with strategies to integrate some of the products that we were doing at CommonWealth Kitchen into Daily Table. And so we were trying to create this whole ecosystem of like food and how it could all interplay together. Fast forward to now, you've got me back at home in East Cleveland and with an apartment in Dorchester. Because during the pandemic, I was, and I hinted at this earlier, my friend Thea James from Boston Medical Center, we had been trying to do this work within the food service. And they had come up with this whole thing around like healthier communities are wealthier communities. And so they had got this fund to figure out how to really say you're not going to fix some of these systemic issues without creating wealthier communities. You just won't. And so as an emergency room doctor, she was saying people are coming in, we know what their ailments are, we know what the issues are, and one of the things we need to do is provide housing and businesses that are owned by the community so we can actually have more healthier and wealthier communities. And this was all well and good until I looked at the deal that they were doing with the grocery store that was coming into Roxbury. And it was going to be owned by white developers from DC. And so I was like, well, Thea, what we're talking about communities. And so she's like, okay. And this was during the pandemic where we were asking some very real deep questions. And so I took a trip out. I was a consultant at the time. I took a trip out to DC, and I saw the model, and it didn't serve the community. And I came back, and I said, this is not going to work, right? It's just not going to work because it's no way for us to actually create this sort of community anchor that I know you're looking to fund. So once we got proximate to the deal, I was able to see like, black folks never get on these deals, right? The fact that it was like, it was non-recourse loans. It was like all this stuff. I was like, whoa, dang, how could we ever get a deal like this? And it took a lot of work to shift the deal over to our group, our community-led group, but BMC did it. They leaned in. They shifted it. Kresge leaned in, shifted the dollars, right? Leaf Conservation Law Fund, like all of these folks who were interested in doing something different, they listened to the questions that we were asking, and they realized that they were in a position to do something different. They didn't just stay on that track. And again, this is similar thing that happened in Vermont. Once you build the relationship and you ask those deep questions about why are we doing this? This doesn't seem right. We were able to shift that deal over to our group, which now the North Star is an employee-owned grocery store that's centered on procurement from aligned folks who are black and brown farmers of the Northeast and producers that are coming directly out of the incubator that's at CommonWealth Kitchen. So now all of a sudden you have a very clear pathway how you can scale stuff up. And without having ownership of the actual transaction, which is the marketplace, how are you really going to change the culture that the culture that we're trying to establish? You can't. And so we said, what we need it's about spatial justice too. If you don't have control over space, you're never going to really get that sort of cultural shift that we're looking for. And so this was happening, and I said, okay, cool. Now what we're going to do is we're not going to have any styrofoam. We're not going to have any plastic. We're not going to everything. And so then we started looking at numbers, and I said, that can't happen. So now I'm on the other side of this, dreaming about like this like utopian grocery store, because now we have control over it. And we don't have the purchasing power. We are looking at some of the margins to buy stuff from local folks. Their stuff is way too expensive on the shelf. The community's looking at, because we're in the soft open right now. And they're like, oh my God, freaking $8 for a bottle of freaking barbecue sauce when I can get Sweet Baby Ray's for $2.99. And I'm like, I know, but, so now we carry Sweet Baby Ray's. But but what we're doing though is we're putting them on the low shelf, and we're prioritizing center shelf for all of the local products, because now hopefully we can deal with some of the same realities. People just grab what is easier, and then they will see. We can put placement and signage around like why it's priced the way that it is. We can have some transparency about, why. So that's kind of like what we're doing at the store now, is trying to get our signage and education around like, it's not, it may seem like it's more expensive, but it actually is way more beneficial to the overall health of the community when we create pathways for wealth to be created. And so one of the compromises, my partner is like, because I said, we're not having bottled water. I said, I'm not selling bottled water. And he was like, bro, do you know we stand to lose like $30,000 a year if we don't sell bottled water? We're right next door to a gym. And these are decisions that I think we all have to make is, what do we do? And I said, we just won't make that $30,000. We're not going to have bottled water. We just won't. And so this is something that is a choice. And I don't know if it will work, but it's a risk. But again, if people don't take risks, you're never going to get the change that we need. And so, and also, it's a situation that if you just pick one thing to stand on, it's a saying that says you stand for if you fall for anything if you don't stand for something, right? So I think that's what it is. And so, but what I realize is that this is still compromise. This is still like this reformative way of working. And it still doesn't sit right with me. Like I'm a transformative person. And so that's when I decided to move to East Cleveland. Because I said, I don't think I can make it work in a city like Boston with all of this. It's way too down the road of like unprincipled laws, policies, relationships, and everything else that don't jive with how I think. So I moved back to East Cleveland to build up Loiter, which is this ecosystem of equitable enterprises right from the ground up. Because like I said earlier, like it's completely extracted from, there's nothing there. They're at ground zero. There's no grocery store, there's no bank, there's no coffee shop. So you can build right from the beginning. It's like, man, that's a beautiful painting that you could do. And it just so happened that that's where I was from. So we have site control over the 4 acres, a couple houses, 20,000 square feet of commercial space that we can just dream from. And we're inviting people to do it. So we've got a group of entrepreneurs that are doing it with. And then we purchased a fermented food company. And this brings us back to my whole thinking around zero waste. If you start with this whole idea, again, some own principle of like, we don't want to have a wasteful society, you have to have a community, you have to have an anchor that's grounded in the reality that you want to see in the future. So we said, well, what better place to do it than purchasing the community owning a fermented food company, which is is zero waste, right? So we now work with farms. Now we're diversifying because it was an Amish. Basically, the sourcing now is all Amish farms, right? And so we're like, okay, well, cool, that's great. Now I get to like go to Amish auctions. If you've ever been to an Amish auction, it's like insane. It's so cool. But I get to go to Amish auctions, and I get to stand up some of the urban farms to integrate into the purchasing power that Wake Robin Foods has. So now I'm starting from a company that is already in 3 states, 50 stores, Whole Foods, Heinen's. We're working on a deal with Myers. And so we can integrate the sort of ethos into a new anchor. And so now that anchor is now investing in the community. We're moving it from the west side to East Cleveland. We just are investing in a warewashing facility, because it's not just about the food. Warewashing means we're using jars. So we can now, people can bring their jars back into East Cleveland. We warewash them, and not just for us, but other companies that are using glass. To now you've got this city that is driving home the reality of more principled policies, because currently it's illegal to compost in East Cleveland, right? Per the charter. So we have work to do when you talk about these things. And so, but the whole thing is, and you know how I found that out is because my friend Emily Broadley from the Harvard Law and Policy Clinic, I called her up. I said, hey, Emily, God, want to help me out? And she was like, yes. So she was like, okay, cool, I'm on it. So she kind of like unearthed, like, her and her team put together this whole policy map of what I could do in East Cleveland if we were to dream about the most sustainable city in America. And so, starting from ground zero, which is where I believe East Cleveland is, by it being the most porous city in the state. And so we mapped all this stuff out. And so what that means is now we're in a position to where we're holding space, we're holding assets, and we're holding a vision, like collectively. So it's not just me, it's like a whole bunch of other entrepreneurs who are tied into this stuff. And I'm just like constantly thinking about ways to do stuff that's cool and fun with people that I want to do it with. And like, I hope today is like a continuation of that. Like I don't know what else to say. It was all over the place. Hopefully it was working. But I think at the end of the day, there's this saying, and I think it was James Baldwin, says, you know, it's hard to believe what you say because I see what you do. And I think, man, I sit with that all the time, because we've been in a lot of conversations with a lot of folks in this room about, like, what is it that's possible? Like, what can we do? And then we go down the road of, like, yeah, something's going to happen, and then nothing happens. And it's okay. I just want to know why, and what do we need to do to move things forward. And I'm not an incrementalist, but some people are. And I think that's okay if some people are incrementalist. And that incremental reformative pathway is needed right now. And I'm realizing this now because there was, like I said, I started Nubian Markets off wanting to have that very utopian market that was zero waste, that was all black everything. And it's like, it just can't work. It just can't work now. But if we find other spaces to invest in to build it from the ground up, I think it is possible. So playing in both lanes and being very clear about what lane we're on, and when you shift from either direct transformative or reformative, I think will be super helpful as we're navigating some of these questions. And so for me, that's kind of where I'm at. I'll end it by saying, like, why Loiter, right? So I named it Loiter for obvious reasons. I think loiter is provocative, right? You're not supposed to loiter, but I see a whole bunch of people loitering back there listening to me speak. So it's like, you can't build community without loitering, without hanging out. And so loitering is the only thing that you can be arrested for by not fitting a social construct. And so without reframing what it takes to build community, especially habitually excluded communities, primarily from my experience, in an African American community that's 95% black. I need to be able to loiter. I need to be able to kick it on the corner and kind of be jovial, and not be criminalized for doing so, because sometimes, sometimes they call it looksy-looing or yoo-hooing or whatever it is. It's the same difference. We need to be able to be in communities and exist in spaces together to learn from one another. And I'll say one more piece, and this is the only thing that because I had some notes, and I didn't go off any of them, but the one thing I did want to say is, because the policy piece, I'm very new to policy, and this is the one thing I'm going to read, because I've been, with my time in New York City, I've been trying to really work on some, and I'm doing some work with the Corbin Hill Food Project, which is super important to know, because now I'm trying to figure out what are those anchors that are needed to continue the work that we do, and to have a policy advocacy organization in New York City that's working to bring food where people need it most, that's connected to black farmers in New York State and Northeast. Now you've got some policy conversations that I've been a part of. And one thing I wrote was this, and I'll just read this verbatim and I'll end it. I'm sorry. But it starts with trust. The federal government doesn't trust organizations like the ones that we all represent. So it doesn't make subsidized credit available to us like industrial producers. Within the federal subsidized and regularized farm credit system, more than half of the debt is held by the top 1% of recipients. These are large landowners, industrial commodity crop producers, and factory farmers. Organizations like the ones in this room, which are working to aggregate small and medium-sized rural fruit and vegetable production, builds urban economic capacity, fortifies community-driven nutritional security. We don't get credit, we get grants, which sounds great until you read the fine print. Grants aren't free money. They enable all of the freedom of an Instacart shopper in a Kroger. We are told what we can spend money on, which usually means operating by the principles of federal food service policy, minimize costs, maximize the number of meals distributed in the grant period, and worry about next year with the next grant. Is a treadmill, not a path to security. Industrial producers receive credit on the front end, research, education, extension, processing, and transportation support throughout the supply chain from various federal programs, and revenue-based insurance subsidies to support long-term production. We get a shopping list. To build nutritional security for all federal lawmakers, to build nutritional security for all, federal lawmakers, and I know there's some in this room, this is why I had to say this, but must start treating nutrition as a priority, not just as a byproduct of maximizing total production and minimizing food service costs. This requires a shift in mindset as well as a shift in policy approach. It requires that federal food system investments reflect shared priorities, not just the economic outcomes of large landowners and corporate consolidators. It also requires that we invest in communities' capacity to nourish ourselves with credit access and supply chain-wide support. Trust us, the organizations that are in this room have been working across the country to build better food system supply chains, often for decades. We need the supply chain-wide long-term support that federal investment gives industrial producers. Without it, universal nutritional security will remain little more than a political promise that comes every 5 decades. So that's what I'll end it with, and I will say that.
Thank you so much. I did not underpromise, and you over-delivered, so thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. Ismail's willing to take a few questions, so if anybody has any questions, just shout it out, raise your hand. You cannot listen to that and have no questions. I have about 30,000 spinning in my head right now. Yes, Liz.
because, you know, the word lots of us are using now is decolonize. And it seems that you were incubated from birth in as uncolonized situation as you can be on this land. And I'm wondering, I work with young people who are already colonized. You know, they're like this all day long and buying things with labels and I live in Springfield, Massachusetts. I don't know if you know anything about Springfield, but we're a minute away from being East Cleveland. Always have been, just barely holding on. Yeah. And I'm wondering, how do you, I mean, these are my people. This is my posse, our posse, right? And not in the brilliant way that you've outlined, but for years they have been having me and organizations like World Farmers and Nuestros Raíces and Holyoke, Massachusetts give this same messaging. How do we teach our cousins, friends, brothers, sisters who are less melanated, and even those of us who are fully melanated, how to begin to work towards this decolonized vision? And how many people does it take? Like, how do I and so many others incubate what you've done or whatever we decide we want, using what you've done as a vision? How do we incubate that when the forces are so much bigger? Because even those who are my friends participate in the whole granting and...
That's a great goal. So I feel like we know about this, like Exodus, right? You got to leave. I think that there's a moment that there has to be some traveling and journeying away from oppressive situations, and that's why I decided to go back home. Like literally, like I think the real answer is I think we have to divest the same way that they divest. I mean, they divest from the work that we do. We get it to a point to where it's beneficial for a tagline and a story, and then the divestment comes. It's very predictable what happens when dollars come into our communities to do this good work. So I've been practicing the word saying no. So even with the project in Loiter, like I'm not getting any USDA money. Like I'm not. I've only asked for unrestricted funding, because we know the data. Like we only receive, Black and brown organizations get 8% of unrestricted funding. So we're not trusted the same way that white-led organizations are. So I'm only asking for what the realities are. Like I need unrestricted funding so we can have the autonomy. We've got the land. I'm telling funders in East Cleveland right now, like the only funding right now that I want is the same types of speculative holding cost that speculators in the market are holding property in our communities. Like I just want to hold the property so we can deal with it later. I'm not doing anything with it yet. I'm not running any programs. I'm just holding property. And so if and that's kind of how I'm doing it. Like because I just don't think that we can continue to do programs. And so to me, it's about ownership of space and just acknowledging like what's possible in the spaces that we're occupying. Like I said, I don't think that I can do what I can do in East Cleveland in Boston. So the Boston model is, it feels weird going from East Cleveland to Boston and the only win I can have in Boston is saying, at least I'm not having water bottles. In East Cleveland, I can say, plastic bags are not allowed on the premises. You can set the rules differently when you actually decolonize. But I don't think that we actually decolonize. I think we just say it, and I think that we don't find spaces to decolonize from. That means you have to divorce yourself from an oppressive system in order to do it. And that's what I'm trying to do in East Cleveland, and I'm trying to invite people. I beg you to come to smaller spaces that can actually do it. Like I said, 3.5 square miles in its own municipality with 5 council people. That means you need 3 out of 5 to create an ethos-based political structure. That's easy, right? So I'm just saying it's an easier situation than, bigger cities that have to deal with the anchors that are already there. So I think we just need to build anchors in spaces. So I guess I would encourage folks to invest in spaces like Springfield, East Cleveland, to invest in decolonized movements at the scale at which. Yeah, no, I think, but that's how you do it. I mean, I think because you have to invest in those efforts. If not, we'll just keep talking about it.
I appreciate you.
Excuse me, coming back.
Hi, Ismail. My name's Christine James, and I'm recovering from 14 years in philanthropy as a program officer and an executive director. I'm trying to decolonize myself. And I am so appreciative of what you're saying because John Merck Fund that I used to work for helped to found FINE and stuck with it for our 10-year spend out and many other of our grantees. But my big learning from being in philanthropy for that long was that people don't do what you do and tell people what you're going to do and ask, don't you want to be part of this? Not, would you please help me? Just like, do your thing and be ambitious and be clear and firm and say, we're going this way. If you want to come, jump on. But I'm not waiting for you to give me permission to go. And I'm telling you, that's more attractive. And then you're going to have to grapple with, now they do want to come with you. And what are you going to do about that? But that's a good problem to have, I would say. So thank you. And I think I have some of my former colleagues in here with me who may or may not still be my friends after this. But you are so right. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to take a sec to respond to any of that?
No, I mean, again, part of it is, like I said, that we talk a lot of times around white privilege, but I come at this space by experiencing like this sort of like privileged space. Like my time with Doug was like very powerful. I learned a lot of how he moved. I learned a lot how he moved in spaces, right? But I also like learned a lot how my mom and dad moved, right? So connecting those two realities was very powerful for me. My perspective is very interesting. Like being in the room with the types of folks that Doug could bring into the room that I was privy to was insane. And so to be able to hear him absolutely say, like, actually it took 23 stores for Trader Joe's to break even. You say that to a funder and you're doing this freaking daily table model, you're saying, and this is the person who actually scaled up Trader Joe's, it's like, oh, I guess you're right, I gotta keep throwing money at this thing. And I'm like, well, dang, okay, that makes sense. The problem is VC money and investment dollars don't go to this work. And that's it. Like, we got to invest in transformative things. And I think that's the ask, is you invest in transformative, and you believe that that's all it is. It's all about money and power. If you don't transfer the power, if you don't put the money in it, we're never going to be able to sustain stuff like this. I mean, sorry, Jess, I'm just saying, like, I walked in, I'm like, dang, okay. Like, the type of revenue you need to sustain it only comes from, like, sound, high quality, high level investment, like, for years. And that's what it's going to take. And until our organizations get that, we're just going to constantly be chasing. But like I said, and that's why that's why I mentioned the whole thing around policy. Like, USDA could freaking do the exact same thing to freaking Farm Fresh, well, actually I won't say that one, to Boston area gleaners in Corbin Hill, Florida, and Farm Fresh Rhode Island, as it does for big food, and it just chooses not to. And so you need advanced credit, you need tons of support, and you need the dollars to actually sustain it. So.
All right, let's say one more thank you to Ismail for getting us going this morning.